Welcome to the Lighter Side of the Spectrum, a podcast where we explore how to find joy, connection, and growth while navigating the challenges of parenting kids and teens on the autism spectrum. Remember that inclusion and hope are key to making life better for everyone, and that even in the most challenging moments, there's always a lighter side. Now here's your host, David Koffer.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Lighter Side of the Spectrum. Today, we are going to be diving into the fascinating world of neurodiversity with a truly unique guest. Micah Preissing is a neurodivergent psychologist, synesthesia, easy for me to say, artist, and host of the podcast, Let's Talk Synesthesia. So I'll let Micah will talk about this, but when she hears music, feels touch, or even smells her favorite perfume, she sees vibrant, moving colors and shapes in her mind's eye. This is a phenomenon called synesthesia, where the senses cross in extraordinary ways. She's here to share her journey, help educate us on neurodiversity, and open our minds to this incredible sensory experience, which I'm so excited to learn about because my son Stone has talked about how he also has this. So I'm really excited to dive right in. So let's get started. So first of all, welcome, Micah. Thanks for joining us from Innsbruck.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm really glad that we had a chance to connect. So starting off, how do you pronounce it? How do you pronounce it?
Synesthesia.
Okay, synesthesia.
No, you
All
did a
right.
good job.
Okay, yeah, I had to practice. I had to practice multiple times. It's one of those words that just kind of gets stuck. But again, for those who aren't familiar with it, as I wasn't before I kind of stumbled across it through my son's lessons and some other things, why don't you explain kind of what it is for someone who's never heard of it before?
Yeah, sure. Synesthesia is a neurodivergent, so it falls under the neurodiversity umbrella, but not like autism or ADHD. It's not a disability, and you wouldn't find it in any diagnostic manual. And I think that's also the reason why it's lesser known. Synesthesia is sort of a double reaction of the senses, as I like to explain it, because, for example, when I hear music or feel pain, not just one area of my brain gets activated, but another area gets activated too. So it's sort of a on top double reaction
A
neurologically in
double
the brain.
reaction. I love that. I love that description. That actually helps make a lot more sense in a way because we react, right? Isn't that in a way what our senses are? It's kind of body reactions in different ways.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, it's just the fact that due to my genetic disposition, due to my synesthesia, which runs in families, by the way, um,
Hmm.
it there are more connections between the two areas. For example, the auditory and the visual part of my brain, they communicate, and commonly in a neurotypical brain, they wouldn't, or they wouldn't as much. So that's kind of the
So
explanation.
yeah, so is there a way to kind of going into that just a little deeper, is there a way to try to explain it kind of neurologically, what happens with the senses crossed that way? Is there any explanation for that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research around the world trying to answer those questions. And in May this year, well, last year actually, I did a brain scan in Toulouse in France, where we looked at this double connection. So we showed myself letters while I was in the fMRI machine, and even though the letters were black, but I perceived them as colored, we could see that the color area would be triggered, and in a non-synesthetic brain, it wouldn't be triggered. So we could see that very beautifully on a brain scan for this specific form. Yeah, so it runs in family. There's a genetic component. It comes down to neuropruning, which connections do we, because babies are born with a very hyper-connected brain. And then over the years,
Yeah.
our brains, depending on our genetics and our environment, they get more specialized, and we build motorway connections between areas that make sense for us. And if you have a synesthesia disposition in your genes, you hold on to some of those connections, which in my case,
Yeah.
I feel like are a lot.
is it overwhelming at times?
I think that's probably the most commonly asked question. And I would say no, but then I am always tired. I am easily overstimulated. I don't like many environments. So I think there's a lot going on. There's a lot to process and suppress in a day. But I would say more the part I struggle more is how sensitive I am, like my sensory sensitivities, and they can be linked both to autism and synesthesia. Most synesthetes are very sensitive, so who knows?
But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you were talking earlier about, I know that they're still trying to explore this and understand this, but like you said, kind of the brain pruning, right? And some of the connections that are made or lost. They're studying that with autism, and in my son's case, with lack of speaking. Right, he's a non-speaker, communicates, and so there's a lot of different theories kind of around that. Do they have any other heightened senses as well? It's interesting to think about. Like you said, is it something that maybe they weren't pruned. Maybe we're born with a lot of this, and then as you develop over time, the brain prunes because you have to kind of develop other senses and other capabilities.
hmm
I don't know. What do you think about that?
What it reminded me of is that we definitely have to mention the connection between autism and synesthesia, which I think is very relevant for your listeners. So maybe I'm gonna speak on that for a bit.
Yeah, please do.
Synesthesia
Absolutely.
Synesthesia is 3 times more likely or common in the autistic population compared to the general population, so there's definitely some shared cognitive profile or neurological mechanism for the two. They're two separate traits or conditions, that's for
Sure.
sure, but there must be some underlying neurological mechanism that they share, because even a mom with synesthesia is more likely to give birth to an autistic child, even though she does not have autism. So there's something going on about these two. And the other interesting thing is that when you have a lot of synesthesia forms, so there are over 80 different forms, that if you have more synesthesia forms and maybe they're more cross-modal or multimodal, then your autistic score tends to be higher too. So they kind of
There's 80
raise
different.
together.
What?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people say even over 100. I think it's quite difficult it's not just senses. So we were talking about senses that I would hear something and then I see something on top. But synesthesia as a definition is much broader. There's another like category called ideesthesia, which is concept synesthesia. So when I was mentioning the fMRI scan we did,
Yeah.
it wasn't a sense. They showed me letters, so graphemes, Latin letters, and numbers. And this is not a sense, right? It's a concept that I learned how to read and write.
Yeah.
And they can be connected to a smell, to a taste, to a color, to an emotion, lots of things. And because they can all be kind of connected, it
Wow.
adds up to so many different forms. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that just makes my head spin because it makes sense why also it would be exhausting at the end of the day if because I think it takes brain power for us to process things anyway. And then if you have basically it's kind of like multiple CPUs working all at the same time in a way in your brain, it seems like.
It is that, and at the same time, though, it also helps me a lot. So when every number has a color, for me, learning vocabulary or remembering a PIN code or a phone number or a name, I remember everything in a color code, which is really helpful, you know?
That would
And
be
then
very helpful.
I have also ticker tape synesthesia, which is seeing subtitles when people speak. So as we speak, I see your words written out between us, which is really helpful for auditory processing.
Wow. That's That's amazing. That is really
I just saw that. Wow. Written out. Yeah.
that is mind blowing. What about then? How about reading and processing information that way? Like when you like read books, or does it impact you in that way in terms of like when you're studying things or
So when I read, I would see color projected onto the book, onto the letters. So the whole book is kind of colorful while I read it. Not the whole page, but at least where I'm focusing on, the words are colorful. And then, I mean, I
are you
think,
able to recall that way? I'm just curious if like you're saying, kind of like with numbers, how you said,
yeah. So the content of the book, you mean?
yeah.
So usually another synesthesia form takes over then because I have thought process synesthesia, meaning everything I think about or like relationships between people or when I work with clients, I see that kind of mapped out in my mind's eye as like textures and shapes, and I see them in relation to each other. And this is kind of how I make sense of a story, a problem, anything I have to remember. So I think if I read a book, this is kind of what takes over. And then, are you familiar with aphantasia and hyperphantasia?
I'm not, no, or not that I'm aware of. Yeah, no, please go on.
It's not synesthesia, but I think it's a perceptual phenomenon that's really important when we talk about synesthesia because it kind of refers to the whole mind's eye thing. So it's a spectrum from aphantasia, which is a lack of mental imagery, which is around 2% of the world, up to hyperphantasia, where people imagine like they have very, very vivid mental imagery. So if I were to ask you to imagine, I don't know, a dolphin jumping out of a coffee cup and it's wearing a cowboy hat. You and some of the listeners maybe saw a very vivid image that was like maybe animated, and you can zoom in and zoom out and like change the texture and the style from realistic to cartoon. And then someone who has aphantasia just couldn't see a thing. So where would you be on
It's
that
like it's
spectrum?
blocked. It's like it's blocked out for them, almost like,
There
or
is
just
just no mind's eye.
wow, that is fascinating.
What is it like for you then?
Well, like when you described that, I was able to visualize it. I mean, I was able to kind of, yeah, like you said, I was able to think about the dolphin jumping out of a coffee cup. Of course, I have my coffee cup right here, so I was kind of think about it. Yeah, I was able to visualize it.
Exactly. And that is so you're maybe more in the middle or towards the hyperphantasia spectrum, but I think it's very important to know in this neurodiversity space that some of us just don't have this mind's eye, or also we have also very different abilities to recall a taste or a smell or a voice. Some people can just replay an orchestra or a voice in their head, and for others that's like impossible.
Right, right. No, I think what I'm hearing and what what I think is so interesting, and like you said, in terms of the education that needs to go into this is just how unique everyone is and how finely tuned our brains can be, right? Like again, we're kind of going from this world of these very broad assumptions and lack of understanding of things, just even regular sensitivities, right? In terms of
Yeah.
how can a child be so sensitive to noise that they need headphones? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that was really people just didn't understand and they would look at kids weird if they had to have headphones. Fortunately, I think at least in most cases, at least here in the Seattle area, because Stone walks around now with headphones. That was like a game changer years ago. Once he got those, that really helped
Hmm.
with his regulation and so many other areas. But we just never thought of it before, right? We just thought, oh, it's just kind of too loud, and we just didn't really understand how that could impact
Hmm.
so much in your brain.
Exactly. And then the emotional regulation part, as you said, like this is the most important thing. You want your child to stay regulated and give them tools to regulate. And a loud street or mall really doesn't, it's not good enough to like
Right.
the price is too high, is what I'm trying to say.
Can you talk about that a little bit, again, from your experience, and just try to explain it in layman's terms to maybe someone who's still learning about regulation or dysregulation and how it can really impact a child on the spectrum or not? Again, someone with, sensory issues.
Good question. Well, I would be really curious to hear what your observations with your son were as well. I remember for me it was a lot of tantrums, and I think the difficult part for kids is that we're often misunderstood in that moment, right? So
Yes,
we don't really,
it's seen as
yeah, sorry.
behavior. Yeah, it's seen as like misbehaving.
Yeah, exactly. It's misinterpreted, and often when there is a neurodivergent parent that was raised in an environment where they pretty much had to swallow everything, they expect the same from their kid, even though they needed something different themselves when they were young. But they got punished, and kind of trained into that thinking of we just have to keep still, sit still, even though we're burned out. Um, and then we give that kind of behavior to our kids. And I think really we just don't take kids serious enough oftentimes. I think that is like my biggest most important take for just raising kids with any sort of story, but especially neurodivergent kids, just not taking them seriously when they mention something like this is too loud, or I don't like, you know, like the picky eaters term is something that just doesn't really sit with
Yeah,
me really well, because adults can pick and choose what they eat all the time. And if a
that's
kid
true.
expresses that and but doesn't have the intellectual ability and the vocabulary to tell you why this is a scary food, um, we really just have to listen and be like, okay, I don't experience that myself, but if that kid reacts so dysregulated, I need to take this seriously. This is not just acting out. This is a serious information, a serious piece of information that I, as an adult who has access to resources, has to put into context and figure out for my kid.
Again, that's a great point that we dismiss it when kids bring it up, or like you said, the little picky eater syndrome. But there's all the time that adults will say, "Oh, I don't want it. Oh, yeah, I hate that. I hate the texture, or I hate asparagus, or whatever it may be because of XYZ." And you're like, "Oh, okay." But if a child does that, they're like, "Oh, they're just a picky eater." What's interesting is that Stone has a twin brother, Ty,
Mm-hmm.
who more neurotypical. I think he's actually probably neurodiverse in his own ways, but again, was always able to communicate fluently. And
Mm-hmm.
he is what again would have been called, and we've been guilty of it. I'll raise my hand. We've been guilty of calling him a picky eater. But as he got older, and I'm saying like even like 5 or 6, right? He was able to explain just like, yeah, I just don't like the way it feels. I can't, it makes me physically ill to have XYZ. And once he
Mm-hmm.
explained that, then it was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, well, I mean, of course we're not going to force you to eat
Mm-hmm.
something that makes you feel sick. That would be cruel. That's a very different situation rather than, I just don't want to try it for the sake of.
Exactly. And I don't think picky eater is generally a bad word to use. I think it has its context. It just, it just yeah, it needs the context of like I'm still listening and I acknowledge that there is a reason for why you seem picky. And yeah, you're so right. If it is the texture, but I think it gets even more complicated when it's actually anxiety inducing different foods and textures, because kids never really hear that. They don't hear adults say, I don't want to eat that because it gives me anxiety to look at blueberries. That's not really a role model we give them, right? Because we just don't eat it. But they are exposed to foods that everybody seems to like, and it's really distressing them.
That's interesting. I guess I'd be curious, do adults get anxiety from looking at foods? I mean, I only ask, I'm imagining so, but that's something I haven't heard of. And is it because adults don't talk about it, or is it they just don't have to talk about it? Like I said, they're just able to avoid it on their own. Like they have more choices. They have more control over what they see, eat, and all that, their environment, I guess.
Um, are you familiar with ARFID?
No.
That's a condition like that is the psychiatric condition for having this kind of restricted relationship with food, and adults have it too. So there's a lot of anxiety in this. Actually, I didn't learn about RFID in my studies at all. So I
Okay.
only that's one thing I learned through the internet of people sharing their story with RFID. But I know it from myself sometimes too. Yesterday I had a hummus that I needed to, finish because before it gets bad, and it kind of
Yeah.
just made me so uneasy. I didn't want that in my mouth. I didn't want to eat it. And then there was this, oh, but I don't want to throw away stuff. And it did induce anxiety having to eat it, which was interesting. I don't usually have that, but I can see how food is just triggering.
I can see that. Yeah, that's a great example. I think probably most of us have had similar experiences. And like you said, it's probably to a different degree. And what triggers it, like you said, whether it's just, hey, I don't want it to go bad, I don't want to waste it. This is, I paid good money for this, but I better eat it, even though I'm not in the mood to eat it. And then you end up not enjoying it. And then maybe you get like some kind of thing like, I don't want to eat this again because last time I ate it, I had this negative experience. How old were you when you first kind of discovered that you had this capability as far as having synesthesia? Was it like as long as you can remember, or was it something that over time?
So the one form that I told you about where letters and numbers are connected to color, we found out when I was in primary school. So I think at around 6 or 7 is when my mom noticed that I keep talking about the color of certain letters. And so she made me sit down, write down all the letters and the color to the letter, which was a very fun task for me to do. But we didn't find a word for it until I was like 10. I'm 30 now, so 20 years ago, the resources have not been the same, obviously, as they are
Right.
now. And that was just kind of a, like a nice trait I had. It helped me with like I said, vocabulary and just remembering things. And it was kind of almost like a magic trick.
Right. Right.
Um, but I didn't know anything else. And even though we found information about people tasting words or hearing music in color, it didn't resonate with me. And I think the reason for that was one thing, the one form was projected. The grapheme color synesthesia is projected. That's a distinction in like synesthesia research. You either see it projected out there. So when I read a book, I see color on the pages, almost like tainted glass, kind of, like a layer on top. I know it's not there. I see that the letter is black, but I kind of see a layer on top.
Hmm.
And then for music and all the other forms, it took me until my mid-20s to find out I had them because they are all associated, which is the other category. So when I hear music, I don't see anything projected. It's just in my mind's eye. So it's in that same kind of inner TV where you saw the dolphin jumping out of the
Right.
coffee cup.
Yep.
So also when I feel
So what do you
pain, period,
see? I'm curious, like with music. So what do you see?
what do I see? Good question. Maybe repeat the question because I was coughing.
Oh no, it's okay. Yeah, I know. You and we were talking about this before we started. Of course, this is our rescheduled podcast because we both came down with colds, and lingering coughs, so no problem. I'm just wondering with music, like you talked about the inner TV, and like what do you see with music? What does that look like in your mind? With is it colors, shapes, combination, or can you describe that?
Yeah, it's all of it really. So it's colors, it's very high definition. Like I have not the painting skills to ever reproduce what I see. It's different for every synesthete too. So for piano music, for example, I see it's very round shapes and I kind of see them come up like maybe like bubbles, and they're
Mm-hmm.
all kind of purple, white, yellowish. So that's piano music.
Okay.
But then for rock music, and that was actually one of the worst nights I had last year. There was a birthday party at a bar of a friend, and it was a rock music place. And I did no, is it rock music? No, it was worse than that. It was
Worse at
like
like heavy metal kind of,
heavy
or
metal
just
kind of thing. Exactly.
yeah,
Like aggressive,
right.
fast, loud. And the visuals for that kind of music, I couldn't even come to enjoy that music because the visuals for that are very strong. It feels like kind of being visually abused, really. So I had to leave within like
Yeah.
20 minutes. It's like
Assaulted,
knives.
like you're
It's
being
all black.
assaulted.
Yeah, exactly. It's black and white knives kind of shooting towards me. The
Mm,
sounds are really harsh. The voices are really like screaming at me. That is that was hard. So I
that would
walked
be.
home crying for an hour. So that was
Oh.
definitely not nice. And then for pain, for example, so period cramps is a pain that I have once a month. So I really know what it looks like. It's very consistent, and it's like dark blue, slow moving, dark blue, dark red kind of shapes. They're very slow because cramps are not, well, cramps can be fast, but those kind of cramps are very slow moving. And
Hmm.
then for a
Hmm.
migraine, it would be more like I would see sort of a net. So if you imagine maybe a like a neon green background and then sort of a pink net over it. Does
Wow.
that make sense?
Oh
Kind of
yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah. No,
But
like I
then
said in
again,
my mind, I'm visualizing it
you
as you
can't
describe it.
replicate pain, so it always looks a bit different. But that's kind of a couple of examples for that. But then my synesthesias are very much something translated into color. And for other people, that's not the case at all. So a friend of mine, for example, tastes sounds and voices, and my voice tastes like Victorian sponge cake to him. So whenever we speak, he would have the actual taste and texture and temperature of foods in his mouth.
Wow. Is
I
that
know.
is that common? I mean, I guess it's just depends, right? All these different types probably just varies in terms of which is
Yeah.
more common or rare with others. That's just
Yeah,
fascinating.
exactly. They vary, and this one is definitely not a common one.
No, I've never heard of that, but it sounds
Yeah.
really wild, really
Yeah.
interesting. Um, this is a broad question, but because I'm sure there's just so many. But what kind of misconceptions do you think people have when they learn about synesthesia or and also just kind of neurodivergence, in general?
So I think for synesthesia specifically, it's often, or at least, that's what we get on social media from uninformed or misinformed people that just stumble over a video that synesthesia, they either label it as schizophrenia or a hallucination,
Mm.
or on the other extreme, they would say you just make it up, you just want to be special, everybody has fantasy.
Oh, interesting. Right. So they dismiss it basically and just they
Exactly. So they
say,
just don't want synesthesia to be this neurological phenomenon, like this byproduct of human evolution that just exists. It's just there. We can see it on brain scans. We've studied it. It does exist, but we kind of jump into those two, either go take your meds kind of thing, or they
yeah.
would say everybody does that, which is always
If
interesting when they say everybody does that, because I'm like, oh, Not everybody does, but maybe you and I. So
Right, right. That is interesting. Even like you said, even in this case where there's proof, where you have brain scans, because a lot of times, right, you hear people dismiss neurodivergence, different aspects of it, because they'll say either it's not quote unquote scientifically proven, even though again you may have antidotes from millions of people. Excuse me. But in this case, there is scientific proof. I mean, you have brain scans and people who are actually studying it. So
exactly.
good segue, because I know that we talked about one of the segments we like to do is fact or fiction. We've kind of touched into it. So why don't we go ahead and ask our producer Dave to do our intro for our fact or fiction segment, and then we'll go from there. We'll go into a quick break and come out with a tip of the day.
Get QuickTime ready, and here we go. This is Autism Fact or Fiction. We're breaking down what's real, what's rumor, and what might surprise you. Let's go.
Okay, so I know, Micah, you came to us with fact or fiction. So what do you got?
So you want me to answer the two kind of extremes that I mentioned?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So yeah, synesthesia is a neurological phenomenon that is well studied, yet for those that don't know much about it, it often seems like it might be a hallucination. And then hallucination often is associated with psychosis or schizophrenia, which it doesn't even have to be. But the most important thing here is that there is a difference between synesthesia and hallucination. And while I'm probably not the best person to explain the neurology of that, but they are just two different neurological phenomena. And synesthesia is so it's automatic and involuntary and consistent over time. It's very stable. There's not much spontaneous reaction as it is for hallucinations. Synesthesia is also, in most cases, congenital. That's the word, right? So you're born with it, which is not the case for hallucinations. So, well, people keep confusing those two topics. They're just, I can see, when someone says I see color when I hear music, that you'd be like, oh my God, it's like this extra production. It has to be a hallucination. So what I want to encourage people is to see that those are two different traits or experiences, and at the same time, just don't stigmatize either. Like hallucinations are much more common than we think. People hearing voices, it's much more common, and it's not always connected to any psychiatric um, disorder like schizophrenia or psychosis. It doesn't have to be, and they're all just things that people have to deal with. So I would just want to encourage us to be kind for any whatever condition it is. So yeah, because people when they comment that, they want to hurt you, right? When they comment, oh, just take your meds if you have schizophrenia under my video, of course they want to hurt you. But also, if I had schizophrenia, like what a nasty comment to make. Just don't.
Yeah, they try to use it as an insult, like it's
exactly
right, as a derogatory term,
and it doesn't make sense. For me, like it's just don't do it.
Well,
just
yeah,
read a bit more.
Well, I was going to say, so my fact or fiction I was going to ask you about is how rare is fact or fiction? Synesthesia is extremely rare, affecting less than 1% of the population. So would you say, is that fact or fiction? Less than 1%.
That is fiction.
Right. Yeah. I think from what I've gathered is, and I'd be curious if this is consistent with what you see, supposedly up to 4% of the population.
Yeah, and it varies for the different forms. So mirror pain synesthesia, for example, that's where you feel the pain you perceive in other people. So if you would get hit in the face right now and I had mirror pain synesthesia, I would feel an interpretation of that pain in my own body because my mirror neurons wouldn't be able to distinguish whether it's happening to you or to me. Does that make sense?
It makes
So
perfect. No, it makes a lot of sense. I want to touch on that. We're going to take a quick break here, and I want to pick up on that on the other side of that because, yeah, there's just something that you just kind of triggered in terms of the non-speaking world and some observations there. So
yes, sounds good.
I hope you're enjoying the lighter side of the spectrum. So far, we're commercial free, but if you're finding value here, one way to support the show is by considering me for a speaking engagement. I speak on unlocking potential, whether it's for individuals like my son or for entire organizations. I also offer fractional CMO services for businesses needing strategic marketing support without the full-time commitment, drawing on over 35 years of experience in marketing. My agency has helped companies and healthcare practices increase their value, grow, and even prepare for acquisition. To learn more about my speaking topics, visit davidkoffer.com. Or if you're interested in our marketing or fractional CMO services, check out koffermarketing.com. If you're enjoying this episode, please leave a review. Your feedback means a lot, and it helps me make this podcast even more useful. Lastly, don't forget to share it with anyone who would appreciate the insights and stories we're sharing here. Thanks again for listening. Okay, we're back here. We're talking synesthesia. And one of the things, Micah, you were just mentioning, again, that triggered something I wanted to pick up on was, like you said, people can sense pain if it happens to someone else, right? And the world I've entered, obviously, the last couple of years through my son Stone, is the non-speaking world, and those who've just recently begun to communicate using letterboards or typing and some of these other methodologies. And it's just fascinating because a lot of them are revealing these, like you said, whether it's synesthesia or other heightened sensitivities, they talk about things like, I can feel it. Like when you're sad, I feel sad. And it's more than, and beyond just like empathy, you know what I mean? Like it's just like, it's almost like they could just really incorporate the pain, whether it's emotional or physical. And like I said, that just really triggered something when you mentioned that
Mhm.
is a thing.
Yeah, no, it is very real. And even though it's rare, again, it's more common in the autistic population. And it really is putting empathy to an extreme. There are two different forms, maybe, that are important for you to know here. It's mirror touch synesthesia and mirror pain synesthesia. So
Okay.
mirror pain would just be like maybe the higher impact. So if you, like I said, got hit or anything like that, I would feel an interpretation of that mirrored on the opposite side of my body. Again, because my mirror neurons couldn't distinguish
Hmm.
between, is that happening to me or to you? So they would just fire because they think it's happening to me. And then mirror touch would be the same thing, but for touch even. So if you would just touch your cheek or someone would come and tap your shoulder, then the person would even feel that. Which can be nice, of course, for like watching someone getting a massage, but it also, in a busy world, it is a lot. And like as a teenager, when people start watching violence and like horror movies, it is very difficult to realize that they are not better at tolerating pain. They don't have that pain in the first place because they have a different brain. They don't feel the pain of the movie in their body. So it's much easier for other people. But
Right.
yeah, I'm very curious to hear though, what do you think it is in your son's life? Do you feel like he can feel other people's pain?
Yeah, he's talked about that. He could talk about how he can really kind of feel and, to a certain degree, almost read their thoughts. Really, I think there's just this heightened sensitivity. Um,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
we haven't talked about it here on this podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with, um, it's currently the number one podcast actually in the world called the Telepathy
Mm-hmm.
Tapes. Are you familiar with that? Have you heard of that?
No, tell me more.
So check it out. It came out a few months ago, but it
Mm-hmm.
really focuses on gifts of the non-speaking community and whether or not they have telepathy. Um, and it goes in
Fascinating.
it's really
Wow.
fascinating. Yeah, it's just taken the whole autism world and the non-speaking world by fire. As you can imagine, it's very, I mean, it's controversial in the sense that, again, we were talking earlier that this is, there's no, scientific proof behind telepathy, but there's a lot of anecdotes that are supporting this. And like I said, within the podcast itself, Kai Dickens is the producer. She's the documentary
Hmm.
creator who's done it,
Hmm.
and she went to great lengths to create experiments, that could be as scientific as possible in these certain situations, and it's taking it further because it's gotten so popular. But it's Stone has
Incredible.
been,
Yeah.
yeah, thrilled with it. We've listened to all the episodes, and he has said repeatedly that he's just so excited, in his words, that we understand his world now. That this
Oh
is
my
something that,
God.
yeah,
That
yeah,
makes me emotional.
yeah, and there's a lot of it that makes sense. And I know, again, there are probably listeners who are going to, roll their eyes and be skeptical, and I get it, right? Because it's a world that we're not, most of us, our society, I would say, is not comfortable dealing with or talking about, because it seems so far-fetched, or just we just don't allow ourselves to think about this possibility because it doesn't seem scientific. But I've seen time and time again in my interactions, our own informal experiments, just our communication situations, where I'm like, yeah, there's something there. There's some, I don't know what you call it. I don't know, you could call it telepathy. You could, we've talked about being on the same wavelength, right? Like, people are on the same wavelength. How many times have people experienced that, where you're like, hey, I'm thinking about my friend John, and then John sends you a text? Those, we don't dismiss that, right? We just kind of say, oh, that's just a
Hmm.
coincidence.
And what I really like about this too, I definitely have to check this podcast out, is that because we're always trying to move away from that deficit-based approach for autism, right? And just understanding that those heightened sensitivities, like there's so much, how can someone pick up on so much more information than the average neurotypical brain? That's incredible. And what a resource, and what a fascinating thing. And just another reminder that autism is not deficits, it's differences. And our world is the context for whether we're going to be challenged with it or be able to use it as anything. So I think that's a really nice reminder that extreme empathy is an amazing asset to our species as humans. If everybody would have mirror pain synesthesia, for example, if we would
Right.
all feel pain in other people, we wouldn't do what we're doing. If
That's
everybody would
exactly
feel
right.
empathy to that extreme, or like your son, like we would live a very different life as a whole of a species, but we
Well,
don't.
that's been one of the many gifts, I call it, in terms of having this experience and having him as a son and being exposed to this community, is that these are lessons that we learn, like you said, that from them, because they are so incredibly empathetic and kind. And I mean, every single one, Micah, it's amazing when you hear them, when they finally gain their voices, all these brains that are being unlocked that have been trapped, for most of their lives. Some of them, again, Stone was 16, some of them are 20, 25, 30. They're not bitter. Not one of them comes out like, I would be so mad, right? Like, I get mad when I think about it because it just seems so unfair. But they are so grateful that they now have the opportunity, and each one of them wants to say, I want to advocate for other non-speak. Their goal is to help all the others. It's like the, no man, no woman left behind kind of approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that amazing, that, and like, it's across the board. It's so consistent, it almost doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. I
you
love
know.
that. So what are the tools Stone is using to communicate?
So he uses a variety of tools. For the most part, so when he goes to school, we use an iPad, and
Mm-hmm.
he just has a an app that we use there, and I'm his partner. So I hold the iPad for him because that helps with his regulation. Typically, hold his hand, and he just types.
Mm-hmm.
Answers questions that way. There are times when we're sitting here doing homework. A lot of times he'll use the keyboard. Again, holding the keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
Around the house, sometimes it's just more convenient. I still have a laminated letterboard that's just like, hey, if I have
Mm-hmm.
a quick question, like we'll do a quick check-in in the morning. Hey, how you feeling?
Mm-hmm.
I'll just hold the letterboard and he'll just spell out, yeah, I'm feeling great, or I have a headache. He can tell me things like that now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a variety of things. And what's
And
exciting is
yeah.
he's starting. And he's going to get there. He's moving towards, because the goal, of course, is independent communication, right? I mean, he wants to get to the point where he doesn't need to have me or another communication partner there. So we've been practicing that and we've been working. I actually have a prop. So this holds the iPad, it's the iPad holder, and it has like this little clip. See, it kind of clips onto the
Cool.
desk. Yeah, and you can adjust, it's got this gooseneck that you can adjust the height and
Yeah.
everything for him. So we've been practicing, like I said, the last week actually with this, because I just got it. And he's doing great. It's just one of those things, it's motor skills.
Mm-hmm.
But he's starting, just like we did when he
Awesome.
first started spelling on the letterboard. He had to teach his body how to move, to the right letters and regulate himself so that it's accurate.
Yeah,
And
that's a lot of work. But
it's
that's
a lot of
really
work.
exciting. Oh my God, I just love products that make life easier for everybody. So
Right.
good.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome. Can I ask you, you said at the beginning that you think your son has synesthesia too. What are kind of the questions or information he has given about that?
Yeah. So the reason I say that is because he told us it was so part of the spelling methodology is a lot of times there are lessons that people write about a certain topic, right? And then so part of and then part of the process is you read the lesson, you read a paragraph, then you ask them to spell a word or ask them a question about it, and it's just kind of help with the motor planning. So there's people have written lessons about all these topics, but one of the topics was synesthesia.
Oh,
When he first
awesome.
started working, again, it was within a few months after he had just started spelling, and it was with a practitioner we had just started working with. And she just literally just kind of picked it because she thought it was interesting. So she was reading through it, and I'm sitting there listening. I'm like, wow, that sounds really cool. And so she asked him, she's like, have you heard of this? And he's like, yes, I have it. And we're like, what? So
Oh, that's amazing.
so she asked him questions like, okay, yeah, do you see colors? He's, or all this. Yeah, I taste them. And so we've talked about it off and on since then in terms of just kind of how he has it.
Incredible. That's so cool. Okay, so he said he tastes colors.
Yes.
Amazing. That's not very common either. I'm sure
Yeah.
there's lots more for him. Maybe he's listening, or maybe you can go check out some resources with him and let him explore the different combinations, because that's what we really need, all of us listening to just kind of read a couple things and relate to them, I guess,
I would
and
love,
see.
yeah, we'll dive into it deeper. It's one of those things where sometimes it's easier for him to be more open about certain topics, and whether it's like creative writing or things like that with his practitioner. Her name's Meg, and she's
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. She's actually gonna be a guest soon because she's just
Oh,
amazing.
cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Um, she's been doing this for about 10 years, and like I said, just has done amazing things with
Mm-hmm.
Stone. And again, she just has a lot of practice working with a lot of different, non-speakers, more so than I do. My experience is limited to Stone. And I'm still, even though I'm Stone's communication partner, I'm also his dad, right? And that's still That's still a different dynamic. There's a lot of pros, but I would love to dive into
Sure.
that, and maybe I can ask Meg to make that a topic of one of their
Yes.
upcoming conversations, because he
You know,
documents it all. I bet he would be open to that.
amazing. And I think one of the potentials of that is if he has, like I do, pain to visual synesthesia, you could,
Yeah,
because pain is so important to know about, right? And if the iPad isn't there or for whatever reason, but he maybe has just small colored postcards in his pocket at all times, or he can just point at something that has an intense color, and then red means migraine, or
right.
or emotions too. Like if this is the synesthesia he experiences, and he could pair the pain to a
Mm.
color or a taste, or and could pair the emotions he feels to a color, and you could just have um less technical things, like more on
That's a
hand things
shortcut,
that you could
right?
just
Yeah, like shorthand,
exactly.
like yeah, instead of having to get
And batteries can't run out.
right,
But it's so
right.
important to be able to communicate your feelings and whether you feel pain. So I think that's one of the things that I would encourage you to look into, because if that is his innate language to communicate some sort of pain, I think then uh, the practitioner will be able to use that and practice it with him. And you really just
I
need
love it.
like his kind of dictionary
Right.
to understand.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
capabilities that again have an impact. No, thank you. I love that. That's a great idea. And yeah, that's one of the biggest areas of communication, right? Is to communicate pain or distress or needs. And that was always the worst part when he was younger, is there were times that we knew he was in pain. But he couldn't tell us exactly, right? I mean, we knew that he was having gut issues, but he could kind of point there and say tummy ache. But what does that mean, right? Now he can at least define it a bit more.
Of
One of the
course, that
things
is
was
so
that,
difficult. Sorry. Yeah.
oh,
Just a
it's
very
awful.
difficult thing as a parent. Yeah.
It's the worst. It's the worst, right? Because you feel always feel helpless anyway as a parent when your child's sick or in distress, and you want to be able to help them, of course, but it's even more
Yeah.
so when you're like just trying to guess what it is. And
Yeah.
yeah, and there's so many parents in that situation. That's a big reason why I'm doing what I'm doing in terms of the advocacy, and hoping that those who have non-speaking children who maybe aren't able to utilize AAC devices, like we had tried, for years, tried to use the Proloquo and speech therapy. Just say, look, there are options out there. Um, keep
Mm-hmm.
keep trying. So I know
So good.
you have a podcast as well. So why don't you tell us about that, and kind of like what's so people can check that out, and what you explore, and what was kind of your motivation behind it.
Yeah, sure. So my podcast is called Let's Talk Synesthesia, and it's on all like regular podcasting platforms like Spotify and Apple. And we talk about synesthesia mainly, I would say, but not exclusively. It's about neurodiversity, mental health, the lived experience. I either invite experts who study synesthesia or related topics, or I invite synesthetes from around the world to just share their stories. And I mean, the stories, they just have to be documented because
I
they're
bet.
incredibly important. We talk about different forms, of course, but then there are artists, musicians. The last episode was with a Canadian man who didn't have synesthesia until he was 41, and then he experienced a stroke. And due to the brain damage and the recovery of his brain, new
Wow.
connections were built. So he acquired synesthesia halfway through his life, kind of. And that is like a terrifying experience if you don't know what it is. So that's been a very fantastic conversation. And yeah, lots of stories like that.
Wow. Yeah, that is fascinating. And again, just when you talk about the brain connections that are built after a stroke, right? Like when it kind of opens up the possibilities of how this would be more common with the autistic community or the non-speaking community, because you just have to figure that it's like, okay, well, we can't speak, so we're gonna like, we're gonna heighten our sensitivities in other areas. We're gonna try to compensate for that.
Yeah, exactly. If there is any damage to the brain, for a tumor, a brain injury, that the brain wants to recover itself and is trying to find a solution. And yeah, I could see that being the same for autism. Yeah, kind of just finding its innate language to communicate. And yeah, I find it very fascinating that you could, at 40 years old, suddenly see lots of colors for all sorts of things and smell stuff that isn't there. And he was so lucky that all the doctors knew about synesthesia, but if you don't, like, it's just a very terrifying thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. Again, I could see where potentially doctors would dismiss it or call it like hallucinations or a lot of a lot of other
Yeah,
a
or
lot
you
of other
just
things.
wouldn't mention it at all because you knew you are now going mad, you know?
Mm,
I think that's the scariest part of the people that don't know that it exists, so I don't even talk about it, because from the experience I have until this point in my life and
mm,
the Hollywood movies I saw, this means something bad, so I'm going to
right.
keep it to myself. And I think that's the
Right.
most harmful.
So that's got to be one of your motivations too, right? Is to take away some of the potential
Yes,
stigma around it.
definitely. I want to give people vocabulary and community. Those are really the two big motivations for the podcast, to have those stories documented so people can go there, relate to it, or, any clinician, practitioner, teacher, parent, to just know about topics that they might encounter in their life, and just step by step raising awareness. And yeah, that's kind of the motivation I have.
That's great. I love it. I think that's what a great resource. Okay, before we go, I talked about also we're gonna have, I know you have multiple tips of the week, but we've got a little intro we're gonna play here. We're gonna do our tip of the week and let you share whatever, one or more, we'll say.
Hey pals, gather around, it's time to speak. We're here with your tip of the week. Strategies and wisdom just for you. Autism parents, we know what you go through.
All right, now it's time for the tip of the week. So, like I said, I know Micah, you said you probably have multiple, but can you boil it down to one or two to share with
Yes,
our
I
listeners?
I narrowed it down.
Okay.
My top tip of the week is to type into your search bar synesthesiatree.com or thesynesthesiatree.com. This is the best resource we have at the moment. It's a list of all the synesthesia forms with anecdotes, definitions, examples, some art. And I want you to, if you have an autistic child, just go through and ask them a couple of questions like, does the letter M have a color? Does it have a personality? Do emotions have a color? Do you taste anything that isn't there? Like the taste is not in the room, and you kind of read a book and it tastes like peanut butter or something like that. Just get some inspiration from that website and then ask yourself or your autistic and neurodivergent family if anything comes to mind, and go from there, because a whole world will open once they say M is yellow.
I love it. That is great because that's something I would venture to say, 80%, 90% of the audience wouldn't think of doing. And I bet a lot of them are going to be very surprised once they ask those questions and start uncovering, like you said, some of these
Yeah.
abilities that are
And
out there that we had no idea.
one thing I would mention here too, because we also spoke about like the mental imagery abilities, synesthesia, and just talking about how much can you visualize in your mind's eye, are fantastic segues with family members that are not open to talk about neurodiversity because they maybe don't want to go into any disability deficit world. They just are not interested. I think a lot of us experience that, unfortunately, where families are just, I don't even want to hear about it. But talking about perception is a fantastic way to open the door. You could ask, do you think A has a color? Or what color has Tuesday? That kind of thing. Or when you imagine the year, do you see it in a circle or a square? Does it go around your body? Or when you think, do you have one thought at a time or many thoughts at once? Or another question I like to ask is, because I have ticker tape synesthesia, do you see subtitles when people speak? And what font is it? And what, font size? And those are all just lovely questions to get into perception. And then you're just one step away from talking about autistic traits if you wanted to.
That's great. I think my font would be Comic Sans, probably.
That is one that brings a lot of joy, I think.
Right.
I would like that to be mine.
It's the lighter side, right? Well, Micah, thank you so much. I mean, I as always, there's so much more to talk about. We should get together and chat again for a part 2.
Yeah.
A little later this year, because so much good stuff to share, and I learned a lot today. So thank you.
Oh, I'm glad. That's fantastic. Me too. It's Hi, Stone.
Yeah, Stone's happy too.
I'm sure
he's been listening.
If he listened, I'm sure he has a lot to tell you now.
Happy. Yeah.
Happy.
Yeah,
amazing. Oh, that makes me so happy.
Yeah. And just as a quick note before we go, that talking about heightened senses is his hearing is incredible. Like, I've got headphones on, but there are times that, again, I've done these podcasts and he's been able to tell me, like, he heard it all, and he's been able to recall.
Because he doesn't. Oh my God, incredible.
It's incredible. It's an amazing journey. But thank you again, and I want to thank all of our friends who joined us on this week's podcast. Again, we thank you for joining us. Please do share the podcast with those who are involved in the autism community, one or the other. We love hearing from you and want to increase our audience because we think that we have a lot to offer. So, Micah, have a great week. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Speak soon. Bye.
For all of you listening, if you enjoy this episode, we'd love your feedback, as we mentioned before. Please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help us. It helps people find us, which is important. We want to get the word out. We want to have a supportive community. And if you have any other feedback, thoughts, guest ideas, feel free to drop me a note at david.coffer@hey.com. Like I said, let's make sure that we bring you content that resonates with our group. So until then, thanks for listening and take care.